Let me go ahead and get us underway. We're just, I think just about everybody's here, but let me open us in prayer and we'll get started on the Constitution. Our Father, we thank you again for your blessings to us. Thank you for giving us this day, and thank you for letting us be together and enjoy this time of fellowship. We pray that you'll help us again, prepare us so that we can know how to live and how to respond and what to do in these days. Strengthen us by your Spirit and help us to do those things that are pleasing in your sight and bring glory and honor to Jesus, the King of all kings and Lord of lords. Hear our prayers for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, I want to take these last two classes to go through the text of the Constitution itself. We're obviously not going to be able to look at everything, but there are a number of points that have been ignored and have been sometimes they've been amended, but many times they've just been ignored. They haven't been amended, and it's important for us to know this. The Constitution actually consists of 7 articles. The Article 1 concerns the legislative branch, Article 2, the executive branch, Article 3, the judicial branch, Article 4 talks about the states in their relationship to the federal government, Article 5 lays out about the whole process of amending the Constitution and how that's to be done. Article 6 makes the statement that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We need to look at that because that's pulled out every now and then to talk about how certain things can't be done because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Article 7 deals with the procedure for ratification, which of course is no longer necessary for us. There are 27 amendments that have been ratified, some under dispute, but nevertheless they are now accepted. So I want to go through Article 1 and cover some of the things that stand out along the way. Section 1 talks about all legislative powers herein granted, shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Now, it's important to note 2 things. The first is that our government is one of delegated powers. That's, of course, what the Founding Fathers were very interested in. They wanted to make sure that was preserved. And the language here is these powers have been granted. They've been granted by the states, so that the states voluntarily agree together to submit to the federal government in these particular areas. The federal government does not have absolute power, only delegated power. Both Madison and Hamilton expressed the view that it would be more likely that the states would usurp federal authority than the other way around. And Madison and Hamilton were the 2 most vehement centralists in the Constitutional Convention. So it's interesting that they were concerned. They said if anybody's afraid of the federal government overreaching its bounds or its powers, you've got the wrong fear. The fear ought to be the states. And you see that Madison makes this statement in Federalist 45. He said, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain to the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And so for that reason, he said, it'll be far more probable that the states will restrict the federal government more than the government restricting the states. Well, that was naive. It's not the only place Madison was a little naive, but that was truly naive. That's completely turned around in our day. The government does everything. Nobody thinks the states have any rights at all, hardly. But go on also, the second thing here is that Congress cannot delegate its legislative power to any other branch of government or any entity. All legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Now that means that all the bureaucratic agencies and commissions and departments and all these other things that give us binding regulations every day of the week, that is unconstitutional. If, in effect, these agencies, you see, have supplanted Congress by their directives, by their rules, by their regulations that they have enforced, they basically are making laws without having Congress debate them and pass them or the president sign them into law. If this portion of the Constitution were followed, We would not have a Department of Health and Human Services. We wouldn't have a Department of Energy. We wouldn't have a Department of Education. We wouldn't have an Internal Revenue Service. We wouldn't have anything, at least not anything like what we have today. The massive bureaucracies that issue all kinds of binding rules and regulations were never envisioned by the founders. If you've ever had anything to do with the IRS, you know how massive these rules are. You call the IRS, they do not know what the rules are either. There are so many. This is so far beyond what the founding fathers ever envisioned. Well, also now in paragraphs, in section 2 of Article 1, we have the directives about the House of Representatives. In the first two paragraphs, you have the thing about the composition of the House in paragraph 1 and the terms of the representatives. The representatives will serve for 2 years. Paragraph 2 lists the qualifications for representatives. They have to be at least 25 years old, and they have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years. Paragraph 3 now refers to the apportionment of representatives. The representatives and direct taxes, they say, shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Now, the purpose is, the whole idea of this is, how do you determine how many representatives each of the states receives? And so for the purpose of representation of the states, they said that they would count 3/5 of the slave and the non-taxed Indian population in each state. That would be 3/5 of that number would be considered as part of the population for the purposes of representation. Please notice that this rule does not state, nor did it imply that somehow slaves were not fully human. That's the way this is read, and that's what people say about it all the time, as if slaves were only considered 3/5 of a human being. Well, the point here is, how do you count them? How do you count people who live within the territory of the state? How do you count them for representative purposes? And they said they would count 3/5 of the total, which is what they did. This paragraph has been amended, obviously, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which did away with the 3/5 rule. But it's ridiculous, and it's an intentional, I think, misrepresentation that modern revolutionaries have spread, that this wasn't somehow a viewing of slaves as something less than human. That is not at all what it says, nor was it intended that way. Two other changes in this provision that were originally included in it have been made, and that is that Indians are now subject to taxation, and the total number of representatives has been set at 435. So that's as many representatives that the House can have. That number is apportioned among the states according to population. Every state has at least one representative, but everything else is determined by population. Then paragraph 4 talks about how vacancies are to be filled. We won't look at that. Paragraph 5, though, is pretty important. We've just lived through this twice in the last 4 years. It gives the power of impeachment to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. This was one of the two most important powers reserved to the House of Representatives. The other is that bills of taxation have to originate in the House. But here it's specified that only the House can bring articles of impeachment. They have the sole power to do this. Impeachment is, in effect, an indictment against a public official because of gross misconduct. So if a president or a Supreme Court justice or even a House member or senator, if they engage in gross misconduct, then the House can bring the evidence and they can vote to impeach him. And that means that he will then stand trial in the Senate. So impeachment is not conviction. It's like a grand jury indicting a person who will then have to stand trial for the charges that were brought against him. And that's what we've just seen in regard to President Trump. He was impeached twice acquitted, so that he was not convicted. But the Senate is the one who is charged with the responsibility of trying the person who is indicted by the House, and it's done that because of this particular section. Now, Section 3 of Article 1 turns to talk about the Senate. And paragraph 1 talks about the composition of the Senate. Each state will have 2 senators who will serve for a term of 6 years. Now, the House is staggered into classes, so you have 1/3 of the House standing for election every 3 years. You don't have the whole turnover. And the same is true of the Senate. These men are in classes, and they will be, you have a class that one senator will be elected in one class, and the next senator will be elected in the next class, and it's spread out also over 6 years. So there's a gradual turnover. If all of them were defeated in their reelection, you wouldn't have a total turnover of having 435 representatives and 100 senators who had never been to Washington before. That will never happen because of the way they've staggered the elections and the terms. So the senators originally, notice this is what's important here, that the senators were chosen originally by the state legislature. They weren't elected by the people. They were chosen by the legislature of the state. You see that provision. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof. Now, since the Senate was to represent the states, every state had the same representation. You had proportional representation in the House, so large population states had more representatives than small states. But in the Senate, all the states were treated equally. Every state gets 2 senators, and they are given equal representation. That was the outcome of what's called the Great Compromise between the large states and the small states. The small states wanted equal representation all the time. The large states said, that's really not just because we have far more people. We need more representation. And so they compromised, saying one house would have equal representation, the other would have proportional representation. Well, since the Senate is to represent the states, each state then chose, the legislature of each state chose the senators. And they actually could direct the senators in how they should vote on issues because they were the representatives of the state. And they had to do what the legislature directed them to do if the legislature so determined to do that. This was a very important, actually a pretty important principle that was adopted originally. It's been changed now by the 17th Amendment, where now the state legislatures do not choose the senators. Rather, they are up for election. As you know, we voted on the Senate this past time, one of the senators. And so that has been changed, but it's important to think about the rationale for this. Why would they put this in there in the first place? Well, you had the House, which represents the various districts in each state. But the Senate was to represent the whole state. And so to be chosen by the state legislature and not the people, that meant that the senators would be representatives of the entire state. What happens when you have popular elections and you use the general ticket like every state does now? The senators, the candidates, end up paying great attention to the large cities and ignoring the less populated cities. In other words, and we'll talk about this in the presidential campaign, but in a presidential campaign, we never get a presidential candidate, or very, very seldom have a presidential candidate come to Monroe. If they think about Louisiana, they go to New Orleans. They may go to Shreveport, may go to Lake Charles, but they go to the population centers because they know that's where the swing vote is. And senators then become subject to undue political influence by the larger cities. And larger cities historically have peculiar concerns that often are not shared by the rest of the state. Often they're much more liberal than the rest of the state. So it happens everywhere, and this has kind of undone the original intention of the Senate. The Senate's representation of the state as a whole is no longer true. Well, we won't go into paragraphs 2, which talks about filling vacancies. Paragraph 3 is the qualifications for senators. A senator has to be 30 years old and to be a citizen for at least 9 years. Paragraph 4 talks about the vice president being the president of the Senate. He doesn't vote unless the Senate is tied, and he can break a tie. Paragraph 5 talks about the selection of officers in the Senate. But here in paragraph 6, we have something that needs to be noted. The Senate is given the power, again, to try those officials who are impeached by the House. And notice this: when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to preside over the trial of impeachment. No person, it says, shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. You can't be convicted unless you get a supermajority in favor of it. A 2/3 vote is pretty difficult to get. It's difficult in our day. I mean, it's very difficult in our day, but it was difficult back earlier on as well. In other words, there had to be overwhelming evidence of guilt before you could get that kind of vote, and that's a good thing. You want it difficult to prove that if a man really has done something, terrible crimes and misdemeanors, high crimes and misdemeanors, that should be obvious. And it would not be hard to get a 2/3 vote when that's true. But when you have trumped up charges, and I didn't mean to use that I wasn't trying to be funny there, but when you have trumped up charges, then you can't get that 2/3 vote, which is what saved the president last time. The Democrats were willing to do anything and say anything, but at least there were more than almost half of the Senate who refused to vote for conviction. Paragraph 7 is those about what you can do to someone who is actually convicted, who is seen guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. You can remove him from office and so forth. We won't go into that. But Section 4, the time, places, and manner of holding elections and assembly, that is the assembling of Congress. In paragraph 2, it says, Congress shall assemble at least once every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December. That's the original wording, but I like the way it says, we're going to force you to meet once a year, at least one day a year. And I thought, boy, that's so wonderful. The 20th Amendment, by the way, changed that date to January 3rd, so they convene every January 3rd, unless by law they appoint a different day. It would be wonderful if we could just say, guys, we're going to let you meet for lunch on January 3rd. So make the good use of your time. We'll pay you for that day. Unfortunately, they meet year-round now, which is deadly for us. Section 5 talks about all the rules that Congress can make. And then you come to Section 6, the pay and the privileges of the members of Congress. And this is so fun, too, because representatives and senators are to be paid for their service out of the federal treasury, it says. In 1789, they set up that they would pay them $6 a day. And I think that's maybe a little low. I'd be willing to go to $20 a day. But not much more beyond that. If we could have it that way, they wouldn't care to be in Washington all year round. They'd want to get a real job and do something productive. But they're also granted in this section immunity from arrest, which at first hits you and you think, why are they given immunity? Why can't they? They ought to be like us. Well, there actually is a pretty good reason. Senators and congressmen are given immunity except in situations of treason, felony, or breach of the peace. So an immunity is important. It's important for this reason, because you don't want the police or law enforcement to be used to attack political opponents, like is being done right now. They're even turning to the FBI to attack particular political opponents. That is wrong. It's the kind of totalitarian action that has been done in China for years, and of course in Soviet Union and all the rest. In our country, that is unconstitutional. You can't use law enforcement to attack political opponents, which is what you see. Imagine if they did not have this. You could get you could get accused of drunk driving, you could get accused of all kinds of things by the police if the president just had his little henchmen going out and arresting his political enemies. We can't allow that to happen. And so that what that does, though, the negative side is that Congress can sometimes get away with just about everything. No, they're not arrested for anything, and it's a bad situation. But it's worse not to grant immunity, at least potentially worse. Paragraph 2 talks about holding dual offices, which really doesn't apply to us now. Well, it does, but we won't get into that. And Section 7, though, lays out the process by which bills become laws. Paragraph 1 stipulates that bills of revenue, that is, tax bills, must originate in the House. The Senate cannot initiate a tax bill. Now, amazingly, some of you might remember this if you're old, and, which I am. In 1982, Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, introduced the largest tax bill up to that point in history, and he introduced it in the Senate, which is unconstitutional. But what's interesting is there was no outcry. Nobody brought the issue up. It actually went through when it was completely unconstitutional. And that, again, shows what has been going on for quite a long time. Now it's just more blatant, but the Constitution is just regularly ignored. It's set aside, and if it interferes with the present dominant political agenda, then nobody pays any attention to it, and people just go forward as if it's not there. Paragraph 2 talks about the procedure for passing bills into law, and it mentions the veto power of the president. No bill can become law unless it's passed by both the House and the Senate and then signed by the president. All three branches of government have to approve of it. If the president vetoes a bill, then his veto can be overridden by a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate. So constitutionally, you see, there are multiple protections against bad laws and bad men. So that if you have a corrupt Congress and they pass a bad law, the president can just go, no, I'm not signing it. He can refuse to sign it and veto. He can veto the bill outright or just let it die on his desk, a pocket veto. He doesn't have to sign it. And then, on the other hand, you see, if there's a bad president but a good Congress, they pass a good law and he refuses to sign it, well, they can override that veto by a vote. In any case, you could appeal the law to the Supreme Court and challenge its constitutionality if it was unconstitutional. So there are numerous protections here if we utilize them. If everything works like it should, there is a great protection in the Constitution against tyrannical laws. Paragraph 3 talks about concurrent orders and resolutions. That is a joint resolution. You've heard about those things. The founders said, the House and the Senate could do a little trick to get around a president they didn't like. If they knew he was going to veto something, they could just pass it as a joint resolution. Those don't have to be approved by the president. And so they say no resolutions or concurrent orders can be done by the Congress unless it's an expression, there's some exceptions, unless you're expressing sympathy or proposing amendments to the Constitution. Then you can do it, but you can't just pass a resolution which has the effect of law, and you do it as a resolution because resolutions don't have to be approved by the president. They are trying to, again, keep the doors shut to corruption. They make a big effort to do that, and we have to appreciate that effort. Section 8 talks about the specific powers of Congress, and paragraph 1 begins with the power to lay and collect taxes. Now, we looked at this last week briefly, but it's important again to see that the only purposes for which Congress can lay and collect taxes is to pay debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. And again, that phrase, general welfare, has nothing to do with welfare programs or transfer payments like we're seeing today. It doesn't even apply to internal improvements, what we normally talk about as infrastructure. Anything that promotes the specific welfare of a state but doesn't promote the general welfare of all the states is unconstitutional. So you can't, they even said you could not dig a canal within the boundaries of a couple of states to benefit the trade that would go on in those states or the people of those states, because that was something that benefited the specific welfare of those particular states, not the general welfare of all the states. So to give money to some citizens or to give privileges to some citizens and not all citizens is completely unconstitutional. And so what we're living in, you see, what we're seeing today with all these policies that are discriminatory, and particularly discriminatory against an act of Congress, which is the Civil Rights Act, we're seeing this being trampled underfoot, and it's being done with impunity. People are given privileges, selective privileges that are not given to all. It's completely unconstitutional. Paragraph 2 talks about Congress being given the power to borrow money. That, of course, has proven to be a very, very dangerous provision, and the potential for abuse and inflationary consequences are huge in this. And the Founding Fathers understood that. They understood this was a very, very dangerous power to give Congress. So your question would be, okay, well, if they understood that, why did they allow this? And there are a couple of reasons that they did think it was okay to allow it. First of all, remember, they're working out of a largely Christian context. They were assuming that the leaders of our country would have the wisdom and the integrity to exercise this power with discretion, that they would not go into unreasonable debt. They would actually be responsible with this privilege and exercise it responsibly. George Washington was in favor of this thing because he just assumed that our country would always have wise Christian leadership. Again, that's a naive assumption, but that's what they were thinking. And the second thing is they actually established a gold and silver standard for the country, and that serves as a natural barrier on the expansion of credit. So they were thinking those two things, and they thought, okay, well, it'll be fine to give Congress the power to borrow money. And you have to remember historical context. They were in desperate need to do that during the War for Independence. And so that's why so many of them were concerned. They needed to have provision where if a crisis comes, you actually are allowed to borrow money. So it's understandable, but it's been a great burden for us. Paragraph 3 talks about the Congress is given power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and between states. We have a free enterprise zone in our country, the largest in the world, or supposed to be a free enterprise zone. Paragraph 4 talks about naturalization and bankruptcy. But paragraph 5 is important. It says that they have the right to coin money, to regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Now notice, it's very important that we see that the language specifies that the Congress only has the power to coin money. And they didn't say coin money because they didn't know about printing money. They were very familiar with printing money. They just printed the Continental and gotten all kinds of trouble about it. In fact, that's the very thing they're trying to avoid here. They don't ever, in their minds, they never wanted the federal government to have the power to print money. Paper money was a disaster. The Continental dollar was a disaster. But what is interesting about this, so the federal government can coin money. What is interesting is this did not give a monopoly of coining money to the federal government. Private mints were allowed. And in fact, of course, foreign coins were circulated in our country as legal tender, because the only thing that Congress can do in regard to coins, they can coin it, but they can also set the standards of weights and measures. In other words, they could tell you how much gold has to be in a coin before it's worth $1. How much silver has to be in a coin before it's worth $1. They set the standards of weights and measures. Money has always been measured by weight. And so the number of grains of gold or silver determined how much, what was a dollar in our country. And so all coins, foreign and domestic, were legal tender, and anyone who desired to could go into the minting business on his own. And there were private minters who ran a very profitable business making coins. And the high quality of the coins made them very popular. So lots of people wanted their coins, and they did very good business. They were okay. So every merchant had a thing where they could say, this is what the Spanish doubloon is worth. This is what the Dutch guilder is worth. This is what the German mark is worth. Because they had all this coinage circulating through the country. It was a free coinage policy. Only the states were forbidden from minting or issuing their own coins. Private minting was not stopped in this country till the late 1870s. You can still find some of these privately minted coins, U.S. coins, privately minted, and there were numerous private mints that had beautiful coins that were greatly valued, as I mentioned. The government is also given here the right to regulate the value of that. And again, that means that they determine the exact amount of gold or silver necessary for the value of a dollar. It does not mean that the federal government has the right to debase the coinage, as has happened since 1965. Most of the people in our country do not understand that there was no such thing as this kind of abomination in our country until 1965. I remember the time. I was 15 years old, and came on the news that night, and Dad goes, "Save your dimes, save your dimes, save your quarters and dimes, because those things are not going to be worth anything." Everything pre-65, some people started saving, because the announcement was made that there was no longer going to be silver in the dimes and in the quarters. That was in 1965 with the passage of the Coinage Act, July the 23rd. Eliminated silver from the dime and the quarter and reduced the silver content in the half dollar from 90% to 40%. Silver in the half dollar was subsequently removed completely in 1970. All of this is equivalent to counterfeiting. All of it is unconstitutional, and it's allowed the federal government to counterfeit money ever since, and it's destroyed our economy more than once. In fact, what is so ironic is the next paragraph in the Constitution gives Congress the right to punish counterfeiters. They actually should punish themselves, put themselves in jail for counterfeiting. So that means that anybody who coined money and did this was a criminal. This is the same kind of thing God condemned Israel and the pagan nations of the world back in Isaiah's day for doing. They debased the coinage. He says your coins are filled with dross. Your silver has become dross. They mix copper or nickel so that you could extend the amount of silver. That's stealing, is what that's called. It's like having a bottle of wine and getting another wine bottle, filling that half with water, or pouring half of your wine out of your bottle in there and leaving half a bottle, and you fill up the rest of yours with water. Well, you got 2 bottles of wine for the price of one. That's stealing. And God condemns this counterfeiting and the issuing of debased coinage using copper covered by gold or silver or nickel. Now, they quit using gold and silver. They use nickel and silver, and that is criminal activity. This clause has never been amended, by the way. It is still in the Constitution. It's just simply ignored. And so debased coinage, the debased coinage we have today, is completely unconstitutional. It is unlawful. Paragraph 7 is another infamous paragraph. Some of the places, I'm going to point you to the places I really despise in the Constitution. This is one of those places. Congress has the power to establish post offices and post roads. If you've ever worked for the post office, you will understand my animosity. Well, if you hadn't worked for the post office, you had to use the post office, you probably understand my animosity. The government is given the power here in paragraph 7 to establish post offices. But again, it's incorrect to think that this gave the U.S. Postal Service a monopoly on first-class mail. They did not have a monopoly on first-class mail. The U.S. Post Office wasn't given a monopoly until 1845. They weren't given a monopoly originally because it was thought by some of the congressmen that the government service would be so superior there would be no need to shut out private competition. They thought, well, this obviously, if the government's going to do it, that'll be the best. Right. You see how naive some people are. Obviously, it wasn't. By the year 1845, you had over 1/5 of the nation's letters were being carried by private companies. Not only the Pony Express, that's the most famous one, but there were tremendous mail carriers throughout the country doing amazingly efficient jobs in carrying the mail. In Boston alone, there were 20 private mail carrying companies. They provided outstanding service. Most of that, of course, was within the city, but you try to get a postcard from one side of Boston to another in less than a year today, and you may not make it. In New York, Blood's New York Express had 4 deliveries and 5 collections every day. You would get a letter in the morning, you'd respond to it, they'd take it back, you'd get a response back before noon, you'd respond to that, send it back. You'd get another response in the afternoon, you could respond to that, and still get one more before you went home from the office. That's how good the private mail carriers were. They were excellent. And they had to be, of course, because the government decided to start subsidizing the U.S. Postal Service so it could compete. And they subsidized it so heavily that the private carriers couldn't afford to stay in business and compete with the Postal Service, which is what they've done now, you see. The Postal Service has never run a profit, and it never will. It never will, because socialism doesn't work. They will always run a deficit, and we will always pay through the nose. You say, well, our stamps are only, what are they now, 49 cents or something? 55 cents, yeah, 55 cents. Yeah. Well, the cost for the socialistic postal service is something like 4 times that. But they're not going to charge you that. You'll just pay it in your taxes and we'll go into debt. It'll destroy the country. When they could turn it over to private companies. And I was speaking at a Lions Club one time, and half the Lions Club fainted when I said, I want to get rid of the post office. They said, how can we get a letter? I said, do you get boxes from UPS? They go, oh, yeah, we love that. Man, they're great. I said, well, I think that's something. If you can carry a big old box, you can probably carry a little bitty letter along with it. Imagine what we would have here. Anyway, by the year 1845, then, you had all of these carriers, and according to Senator James F. Simmons, a senator from Rhode Island, he said there are 20 letters sent outside the mail for every one that is carried by the mail. He's talking about in the major routes across the country. And the same year, that was in 1844, Congressman John P. Hale of New Hampshire warned that the way things were going, the post office would be destroyed by the competition. So what was their response? Were they saying, well, I guess we can't do it. We can't do it as well as private companies. No, that's not what their response was. Their response was to pass the private express statutes, which strengthened the ability to prosecute private mail carriers. It became unlawful for private mail carriers to carry first-class mail. The postage rates for the government service were greatly subsidized so that the price was brought so low that the private carriers couldn't compete. The bill's sponsor reminded his colleagues, he said, it is not by competition but by penal enactment that the private post will be destroyed. Yeah, that's the only way you can destroy the free market is put people in jail, and that's what they do. The other thing about this is the authority to build post roads. This is almost as bad as the post office. This is the federal highway system. This is the part of the Constitution that they use to justify the federal highway system. And some of us spend a lot of mornings and afternoons working on this monster. But here is the federal highway system, and it's allowed here. And Congress and the people, the majority of the people, were fearful of giving the federal government so much control over so much land. There was occasional pressure to start a federal highway system using this post roads idea. You need roads for the postal service to use. But it was voted down over and over again because people were afraid to give the federal government that much land. Finally, the idea of giving the states, the states started thinking, wait a minute, we can get free highways if we allow this, or at least highly subsidized highways and roads. And so the greed and the willingness to get subsidized improvements in your own state won out over principle. And so the government was given the right to obtain land to build post roads, and the federal highway system was born. In paragraph 8, Congress is given the power to grant patents and copyrights, and this is a very important biblical right, a biblical concept. Ideas are property, and to steal them is equivalent to robbery. One of the reasons why we've had so much inventiveness in our country and innovation in our country is because of this provision in the Constitution that protects intellectual property. It makes it worthwhile, you see, to spend a lot of time and energy and money developing new things, inventions and new procedures and all of that. You know you can get rewarded, that it's actually going to be beneficial if you help us to do something in a better way. So the fact that these laws are not more honored is a dangerous sign. This is not for greed. It is to protect to give incentive to inventors and creative people to use their gifts to promote to change and better inventions and better procedures. And they can know that their time is going to be rewarded, so it's worthwhile to do. Well, paragraph 9 and 10, Congress is given the power to establish inferior courts. Paragraph 10 refers to punishing piracies and felonies on the high seas. But paragraph 11 talks about Congress alone has the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal. Marque and reprisal letters are authorizations given to private citizens so that they can act in behalf of the country to retaliate against enemies of the country. In the day, it was retaliating against pirates or ships from other countries antagonizing American citizens or something like that. So you're acting in behalf of the government. But the point here is that war is so serious that only an act of Congress can authorize it. The president is not to be allowed to enter into war without a declaration of war passed by the Congress. Now, this has been practically ignored numerous times, and it has appalling consequences. For a president to try to provoke, and in fact, what's happened is many times the president tries to provoke Congress into declaring war by doing something underhanded. It's happened a few times in our history, so that he allows something or encourages some kind of action from a foreign power to use as an excuse to get Congress to declare war, and we get into war. But the Founding Fathers desperately wanted to stay out of war as much as possible because they understood the cost of war. We don't understand that anymore, but they did. Paragraph 12 gives Congress the power to raise and support armies. Again, this was George Washington's great concerns, one of his great concerns, but notice the limitation. The money raised for this purpose can only be used for 2 years, no longer than 2 years. That was intended to discourage standing armies. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist 26, gives the rationale for this. He says the legislature of the United States will be obliged by this provision once at least in every 2 years to deliberate upon the propriety of keeping a military force on foot, to come to a new resolution on the point, and to declare their sense of the matter by a formal vote in the face of their constituents. They are not at liberty to vest in the executive department permanent funds for the support of an army if they were even incautious enough to be willing to repose in it so improper a confidence. Well, you see, again, he could not imagine the people of this country putting up with a permanent army. Why would we pay for a permanent standing army? If you have a standing army, you have to justify its existence. And if you're going to justify its existence, they better be shooting at somebody. They better be in war. And our founding fathers and the people of this country in the first at least century, they were very concerned, or at least the first half century, they were very concerned to avoid war at all cost. Section 21, or paragraph 15 rather, of Article 1 talks about, it gives Congress the power to call forth a militia. A militia was a drafted army of citizens as opposed to a professional army. And again, George Washington felt strongly about giving this power to the federal government, and he argued vigorously for it prior to the convention and even said a few things about it during the convention. But he was equally concerned to limit the use of a militia. So there's a threefold limitation, you notice, in the Constitution. A militia can only be used to execute the laws of the Union, secondly, to suppress insurrections, and thirdly, to repel invasions. These restrictions mean that a drafted army cannot lawfully be used outside of the borders of this country. You cannot take a drafted army outside of our country at all. You can't take it to Europe or Asia or anywhere else. Washington and others were concerned to discourage involvement in foreign wars, and for this reason, only volunteers were used in the Spanish-American War and the Mexican War and the campaign in New Mexico led by General Pershing. General Pershing, you remember, was in 1913, he was chasing Pancho Villa. Villa crossed the American border, went back into Mexico. And when Pershing realized he crossed the border, he stopped his pursuit at the border, called his men and said, I need volunteers. I need volunteers to cross the border and go after Pancho Villa. He got volunteers and pursued him across the border because he knew, I don't have the authority to take the militia across the border. So he had to stop, get volunteers, and then continue to pursue Pancho Villa, and he caught him. That's Pancho Villa standing next to General Pershing. But that's how self-conscious he was about this. It was not until Woodrow Wilson requested a drafted army to fight in Europe in World War I that drafted armies were used outside of this country. Many legal challenges followed Wilson's actions, but the Supreme Court, a liberal Supreme Court, upheld this action even though it was clearly and plainly unconstitutional and still is unconstitutional. From this point on, though, the term militia was identified with the Army. This is one of the reasons why people object to the Second Amendment when people say, hey, we have the right to keep and bear arms. They say, no, the militia has the right to do that. The Army does, not you. The militia. It's for a well-regulated militia that you have that right. That's the way this is where the logic comes from. A drafted army has been used contrary to the Constitution in every war since World War I. So you have World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iran, Afghanistan, and on and on and on. This is all unconstitutional. Paragraph 17 grants Congress the exclusive right to legislate in the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia was 10 miles set apart for federal buildings and federal meetings. It was never intended to be a state, and they would have been appalled that we would ever even consider it. Of course, the Democrats are going to try to make it a state, and if the Republicans go along with that, it will be a complete disaster. In paragraph 18, Congress is given the power to enact laws necessary to enforce the Constitution. This is that infamous Implied Powers clause, which has been the basis of so much abuse in this century. The Anti-Federalists warned against the potential for abuse at this point. But both Madison and Hamilton countered that argument by saying that the provision only applied to those powers that were expressly granted to the federal government by the Constitution. Of course, that's true. That's exactly what this is talking about. But they said, you have no danger of Congress using this clause to expand and usurp authority the Constitution doesn't expressly grant it. Of course, again, they were wrong. Here's James Madison's statement. Every such unconstitutional act of the federal government will be an invasion of the rights of the states. These will ever be ready to mark the innovation, to sound the alarm to the people, and to exert their local influence in effecting a change in federal representatives. In other words, if they ever did that, he said they would vote out the whole Congress. Our people would. We wish, but they don't. Abel P. Upshur, the great jurist of the 19th century, he confirms this view. He says, strictly speaking, then, the Constitution allows no implication in favor of the federal government in any case whatsoever. Every power which it can properly exert is a granted power. All these are enumerated in the Constitution, and nothing can be constitutionally done beyond that enumeration unless it be done as a means of executing some one of the enumerated powers. These means are granted, not implied. So the clear intention of the founders has been completely ignored numerous times, and the federal government now is accepted. It has the right to do anything it wants, and it's a disaster for us all. Section 1, Article 1, Section 9, it talks about the limitations of Congress. Paragraph 1, Congress is not allowed to prohibit the importation of slaves until 1808. That's a controversial thing. It was done because the New England states were involved in the slave trade and they did not want to lose. That was a treasure trove for them, and they did not want to lose the business of that. So they negotiated with the others, people who were opposed to the slave trade, to get the privilege of doing it for up to 1808. And in 1808, it was refused. Now, you see, what this means is that the only nation in the history of the world to prohibit the slave trade in its Constitution is the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States outlawed the slave trade in the Constitution. That was not a law they had to pass. They put it in the Constitution. And the CSA is the only nation in the history of the world ever to do that constitutionally. Paragraph 2 talks about the writ of habeas corpus, which is extremely important. Habeas corpus literally means present the body, show me the body, produce the body. And what it means is if a man is arrested, he can't be held without charges. This is a common tactic of totalitarians. They just arrest their enemies, put them in jail, and they'll try to dream up charges against them and put them on trial. Well, the writ of habeas corpus can be given saying, you need to show cause. Why? On what basis can you keep this man incarcerated? How can you keep him under detention? And so you can't keep a man in jail without cause. It's an important freedom. The Founding Fathers understood how tyrants use this all the time, and they wanted to make sure that this would not be done in this country. Paragraph 4 talks a very important, capitation and direct taxes are prohibited. The word capitation here means it refers to a direct tax against a person's physical property or productive efforts. So property taxes are outlawed here. Inheritance taxes are outlawed here. And income taxes are outlawed here. All of them were considered unconstitutional. It was on the basis of this clause that the Supreme Court ruled the income tax unconstitutional in 1894. The income tax was seen as a direct tax on the person, on a man's productive efforts. It discouraged work because the more you worked, the more you had to pay. And so they said, no, that's a capitation. That's an attack, a direct tax on the person who is working. Now, in spite of the ruling of the Supreme Court in 1894, Congress passed the 16th Amendment, and it was ratified supposedly by the states in 1913. And so we now have the Internal Revenue Service thanks to the 16th Amendment. But even so, even those who were in favor of the income tax would never have supported our modern taxation and the horrifying bureaucracy of the IRS. The picture there is a picture of the original income tax form, the first one. It's one page, one-sided. And look at what it says. It actually, here are the tax rates. It provides for a 1% tax on income over $3,000 and not exceeding $20,000. In other words, you didn't pay anything if you didn't make $3,000. And if you made over $3,000 and less than and you didn't make more than $20,000, you paid 1% of your income. This meant that the vast majority of citizens in our country paid no tax because the average income for a working man in 1913 was $800 a year. Most men never made this much. Married couples received an exemption of $4,000. So they would have had to make far more. Most married couples would never have had to pay income tax at all. And even on incomes of over $20,000, look at the surcharge. Here's the schedule. It's a progressive schedule, which is another discussion, but look at this. 1% surcharge on income from over $20,000 not exceeding $50,000. 2% $50,000 to 75, 3% 75 to 100, and so forth. The top tax bracket is 6% for income over $500,000. Almost nobody in the world made that much money. There were a few, but not many. The tax, in fact, was so low that young men went ahead and went to the IRS and paid money that they didn't even owe so they could show the girls that they actually made a lot of money. They had to pay income tax this year. They were trying to impress the ladies. So during the debates in Congress over this income tax, some of the opponents said, well, once you pass this, you realize that the tax rates eventually might climb as high as 20%. Senator William Borah of Idaho was indignant that anybody would even suggest that and ever think that this law could be abused like that. He said, who could impose such socialistic confiscatory rates? Only Congress. And how could Congress, the representatives of the American people, be so lacking in fairness, justice, and patriotism? There you go. In spite of this, and similar expressions of outrage, by the way, by 1919, only 6 years later, the maximum tax rate had grown from 7% to 77%. The minimum taxable income had been lowered to $1,000, and so much for fairness and justice and patriotism. Let me jump to section 10, which are the limitations of the states, prohibitions on the states. The states are prohibited from coining money, issuing bills of credit, and most importantly, notice this, making anything but gold and silver coin legal a tender in payment of debts. The framers are forcing us to be on a gold and silver standard, never again utilizing fiat or paper currency, money that's value raised exclusively upon the word of the government, the fiat of the government. If anyone contended then that the federal government could issue paper money, this clause prohibits it as circulation for legal tender. The states are prohibited from making anything legal tender within their borders except gold and silver coins. And thus, the only place paper money could be used is in the District of Columbia, which would be fine with me. Let them use the paper money. But look at what this was taken seriously for a number of years. People used to care about this provision. The older Federal Reserve notes used to have a statement justifying the usage of their existence. You note the phrase on the face of the bill. It's up there in the corner where you can see it, and here's what the phrase, every Federal Reserve note had this phrase on it. This note is redeemable in lawful money. What are they talking about? They say, look, don't get upset. We understand this is not lawful. We understand that paper is unconstitutional. We understand it could be criminal. But we promise you that if you will take this paper to a bank, you can get real money. You can get legal tender, gold and silver coins. It's a Federal Reserve. This is not a silver certificate, by the way. Some people say, oh yeah, I had the old silver. It's not a silver certificate. It's a regular $10 bill. Now look at your money now. See if it has that statement on it. It was just removed. Without authority, they just took it off because they thought, We don't want to have it on there anymore. But nothing has been done to this clause. This clause has never been amended. It has never been taken out of the Constitution. It's just been ignored to the point that nobody realizes that paper money is legal. The fiat currency of our nation has no constitutional standing. Well, there's another provision in there. There's another picture of the old income tax form. We can look at that and sigh romantically about it. One other provision in this section I just mentioned. This section on the limitations of the states actually prohibits states from keeping troops or ships of war in times of peace. Another effort to prevent states from getting into war or getting us into war in any way. Now, what you see when you begin to actually read the Constitution, you see that there are just innumerable places that haven't been amended. They're just ignored. They haven't been changed. They're just ignored. And most Americans have no idea that this is happening. In 2019, the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship Foundation did a survey of a number of Americans trying to find out how much the average American knows about the Constitution. Here are some of the findings. More Americans can name the Three Stooges than the three branches of government. A third, 33%, cannot name a single right protected by the First Amendment, not one. More than 1 in 10, 10%, said the Bill of Rights protects the right to own a pet. 66% believe that the Founding Fathers put the phrase, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, in the Constitution. That's, of course, Karl Marx. That's one of the platforms of the Communist Manifesto. But most Americans believe that's in our Constitution. 1/2 of those surveyed said if the Constitution was up for a vote, they would not adopt it. They would vote against it if it were put to a vote. Even fewer believe that Congress should have to follow the Constitution. James Madison made the statement that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Well, that's true. Thomas Jefferson said it better. He said a nation cannot expect to be both ignorant and free. That's where we are. We have 4 generations at least of abjectly ignorant people who know nothing about the foundations of liberty. So for the sake of our nation and our own personal freedom, it's essential that we understand the biblical and legal foundations of liberty. Otherwise, this constant revolution that's going on it's unbelievable in the way it's moving so fast. And it's moving so fast because people don't care for the most part, but they don't have, even the people who care have no idea what to do. They don't know what they can do, what their legal rights are. One of the things we have to do is understand our Constitution. With all its flaws, it still would be a pretty good protector against the madmen that are running our country today. Okay, sorry, a little long, but do you have any questions real quick? We've got about 3 or 4 minutes. Any comments? Yes, Jamie?
So if we have a constitution that we could fall back on and say this is illegal what you're doing, it doesn't seem to really matter that there were instances that they did that, they took it to the Supreme Court, we had a liberal Supreme Court, and they ruled against the Constitution. So what do you do about that? Because I'd say, why don't we just teach a whole bunch of people what the Constitution means and say, this is the rights we want and we want you to follow them, because the Supreme Court would rule against it anyhow. So you feel kind of powerless. What are you supposed to do about that?
Well, I think we do all the things we're supposed to do. We teach about it, we make sure we understand it ourselves, and then we use all of our avenues to appeal. So yes, you will end up at the Supreme Court, and you're probably right, they would not stand with us. So what is the next thing that can be done?
What should they have done, like in the instance of World War I, when they had, the Armies going into other countries, and then the Supreme Court ruled against it? Then
Well, they did.
They have stood up to that.
Well, there were legal challenges. I don't know that they ever reached the Supreme Court. They may have, but I can't recall that they did. But the avenue the southern states took, you see, was a legitimate legal avenue. When the government is determined not to follow the Constitution, like the colonies viewed King George, they just said, we're appealing to you on the basis of our own documents, our charters that you agreed to. These are your words. You agreed to these things. And you're not going to follow it? Okay, well then we are free from any obligation to submit to you. The states in the South said the same thing. They kept appealing and saying, stop, this is not right, it's unconstitutional. They got threatened. They said, okay, well then in that case, we'll start our own country. We don't have to be a part of the United States, and we still don't have to be a part of the United States if that's the way the United States is going to be. And that's not treason. That's not insurrection. That's simply seeking to preserve all the rights that God in our Constitution gives us. And the Confederate Constitution is a better Constitution in a number of points. It's not perfect either. But they had learned some things, and they put some of those things into the Constitution of the Confederate States that you don't see in the American Constitution. It would be a great study to go through the Confederate Constitution because there's some really insightful, helpful things there.
But let's follow up on that. Do you have any state right now willing to do that?
To withdraw from the Union, there are some that are just.
We have a Democrat governor who's not.
Oh, no. I didn't say our state. I didn't say our state is ready to do it. But what we need to do, one of the things we can do is appeal to our representatives, state representatives, and just say, you must defend us. You must defend us here. That's your obligation. That's what you vowed to do when you took office. We expect you to defend us here. And to do the interposition, nullification, all the things that they have a right to do, they need to do that. And they need to include the fact that if the federal government, if the United States want to try to pressure us and attack us, we need to be ready to take action. And that would be withdrawal. Yeah, Will? Yeah.
And then they wind up enacting. They wind up under the thumb, got to fix them over the very things, and then the remedy comes out as like. That's the direction it's going. Not that we shouldn't fight for it, and be Elijah out there doing everything that we can for Nehemiah, and that's what we're called to. People won't listen, and they've forgotten.
Well, and you're right, and this is one of those things where we can clearly see the church's failure here. How many, not just Christian people who call themselves Christians, how many evangelical Christians would be appalled at what I said? A lot. And they are supporting this, they voted for this man and these people that are ruling, and they still are defending them and mocking anybody who objects to it or raises a critique, much less a disagreement. You can't even critique. If you contradict, you're obviously a racist and white supremacist and don't deserve to live. But you can't even bring critique anymore. So it is absolutely the case. We brought this on ourselves, just like God always says. He will defend us, but we have to be faithful to Him, love Him, and fear Him, and not try to appease the revolutionaries. Any other things? Okay, let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for your blessings to us. We do pray that you will deliver us, that you will help us. We confess that we have failed, and we see very clearly when there's this much darkness, it's obvious that we have not been lights in the world. So forgive us for our sins. But Lord, look upon us with favor. Lift up your mighty arm and deliver us, defeat our enemies. Put their feet in slippery places, and help all their plots, may they fall on their own heads. And deliver your people and revive your church so that we can see your name glorified and the blessings you've promised flow again to our land. For Jesus' sake we ask it. Amen.